What is the role of atonement? The ideas of salvation and atonement are very closely linked in Christianity. Atonement is the idea of the relationship between humans and God being healed, with God and humanity becoming united. Christians believe that Jesus' death, and therefore his salvation, allowed humans to begin the process of atonement. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. John 3:17. This quote from the Gospel of John shows the belief that God allowed the process of human atonement to begin by sending Jesus into the world. Christian beliefs. The events in the last days of Jesus' life, including the Last Supper and Jesus' crucifixion, resurrection and ascension, form the basis of many key Christian beliefs. These events are described in each of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. What is eschatology? Eschatology is a term used to describe religious ideas or beliefs about death, judgment, and the afterlife. While most Christians believe that there is some form of life after death, there are various Christian interpretations of this belief. Christianity teaches that heaven is a perfect place where they will be united with God. Heaven is a place of eternal life. Every person will be accountable to God for their deeds and actions in this life, and that, although no person can live a perfectly righteous life, Jesus' death and resurrection made it possible for people to be saved by God's grace and to enter the kingdom of heaven in the afterlife. What are Catholic beliefs about life after death? The Catholic Church teaches that after death, people who have been perfectly purified will go to heaven. Catholics who have died with unforgiven sins will go to purgatory. Those whose sins remain unforgiven and who are not remorseful for their sinful acts will go to hell. These are likely to be people who committed hideous crimes against humanity and humankind, and whose evil actions had a wide-reaching impact. Most Catholics believe that all Christians will eventually go to heaven, and that the good followers of any religion are able to go to heaven. What are Protestant beliefs about life after death? Protestants do not believe in purgatory. Article 22 of the 39 Articles of the Church of England states that there is no such place. The justification for this is that purgatory is not mentioned in the Bible. Some Protestants also believe there is no such place as hell, only levels of heaven, and that everyone will eventually reach heaven. Some evangelical Protestants believe in the resurrection of the body and the idea that everyone will be raised on the last day to be judged by God. Liberal Protestants believe that the soul lives on eternally after death in a spirit world. They believe that a person's afterlife will depend on how the person lived their life on earth. Biblical teaching, Corinthians 5:1-10, is a key passage in understanding Christian beliefs about the afterlife. It states that Christians will have a non-physical home in heaven, and it also states that because Christians should be aiming for heaven, they should do all they can to please God on earth. They will be judged by God on the good and bad deeds they have done on earth. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each of us may receive what is due us for the things done while in the body, whether good or bad. Corinthians 5:1-10. Christian beliefs. The events in the last days of Jesus' life, including the Last Supper and Jesus' crucifixion, resurrection and ascension, form the basis of many key Christian beliefs. These events are described in each of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. What is the problem of evil and suffering? Various types of evil and suffering are evident in the world. This can cause problems for many Christians as they believe in a loving, powerful, and all-knowing God. What are the types of evil and suffering? There are 2 types of evil and suffering: moral evil and suffering. This is suffering caused by the actions of humans. Examples include acts of murder and war. Natural evil and suffering. This is suffering that is caused by nature and has nothing to do with the actions of humans. Examples include earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, and disease. How does evil and suffering cause problems for religious belief? The existence of evil and suffering is important because it can cause problems for Christians' belief in God. God is described as all-loving, as stated in Psalms 103:8. The Lord is compassionate and gracious. Some Christians cannot believe that an omnibenevolent God would design a world full of natural evils. They find it easier to believe these are random acts of nature. Some Christians also find it hard to believe in an omnipotent God. They question why God would allow humans to cause so much evil and suffering if he had the power to stop them from doing so. Another problem relates to the idea that God is omniscient. This means God would have known about all the evil and suffering that would come from him creating the universe the way he did. Some Christians therefore wonder why he did not create the universe without this potential for evil and suffering. This suggests that, because evil and suffering clearly exist in the world, either God does not exist or he cannot be omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient. Some religious people find that when they experience evil and suffering, it can present a challenge to their faith. They may reject religion as a result. What is the problem with evil and suffering for Christians? Christians believe in an omnipotent and omniscient God, so some find it difficult to understand why evil exists in the world when God has the power and knowledge to prevent it. Christian beliefs. The events in the last days of Jesus' life, including the Last Supper and Jesus' crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension, form the basis of many key Christian beliefs. These events are described in each of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. What are the responses to the problem of evil? There are various Christian responses to dealing with the problem of evil and suffering. Some Christians believe it is pointless trying to understand why evil and suffering exist, as God's will is beyond human understanding. Others take a theoretical approach to tackling the problem and try to make sense of it using reason. Some Christians believe the presence of evil is an opportunity to respond in a practical and compassionate way. What is the biblical response? The biblical response suggests that people cannot understand why God allows evil and suffering to exist. Suffering is a part of human existence and enables Christians to demonstrate their commitment to God. The biblical response uses the book of Job, which is found in the Old Testament. Job was a devout and sinless man who led a good life. Satan convinced God that the only reason for this was that Job had a pleasant life, suggesting this made it easy for Job to be faithful to God. God decided to see whether this was the case and allowed Satan to test Job. Satan did this in several ways, for example, killing Job's sons and daughters and making Job sick. Although Job began to question God's goodness, he defended God to his friends, and when God heard this, he blessed Job. Additionally, the Psalms show that suffering is intended to be a part of life and that joy and suffering cannot exist without each other. They also show that suffering can bring Christians closer to God. What is the theoretical response? The theoretical response argues that evil and suffering are not God's fault. Moral evil is caused by humans' misuse of the free will given to them by God. Additionally, evil and suffering in this life are part of God's long-term plan, and people who suffer will be rewarded with eternal paradise. This is known as the veil of soul-making response. The world exists as a place for humans to develop their soul by being tested. What is the practical response? The practical response is to show compassion to people who are suffering, offer those people help, and trust that God will deliver an answer to the problem. An example of this is intercessory prayers, which are prayers asking for God's help for people in need. Jesus also taught that evil is something that can be fought, for example, by feeding the hungry and healing the sick. Christians can therefore follow the example of Jesus by working hard to tackle evil and suffering. For example, they can do this by setting up food banks, donating money to charity, and becoming doctors and nurses. What does the book of Job teach Christians about evil and suffering? Suffering allows Christians to demonstrate their commitment to God.